and you live your life in a way that you want to show God that you want to be with Him forever. And so when that time comes, there is a sense of thanksgiving, a sense of relief, a sense of victory when you lay to rest a brother in Christ. So we had him for 74 years. Actually, I only had him for 42 years. Sometimes it felt like 74. We appreciate you praying for us and us having a safe trip. Last year, we studied through the Gospel of Luke. And we hit some highlights from the Gospel of Luke, from the life of Christ, and focused on some lessons that He has given us in that Gospel that help us in our daily lives. And those lessons are on the church's website if you care to go look at them again. Luke wrote a second book that is the companion volume to the first book. And the second book is, of course, the book of Acts. And I want us, as we have opportunity this year, to look at the pattern for the church that Jesus established. That pattern being found primarily in the book of Acts, and then supported from passages in other parts of the New Testament. Now, ladies, I want you to look for a moment at your wedding ring. Take a look at how it is designed. The stone that is in it. The type of stone. How the stone is cut. The ring itself, and its design. There are probably thousands of different designs for wedding rings. And the composition of the ring, the composition of the metal. Now, when we got a new wedding ring for Rachel, we planted her old rings in the garden, but they didn't grow up, so we don't know where they are. So when we got a new wedding ring, Rachel decided to put an inscription in Hebrew on the outside of the band. And the inscription says, "I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine," from the Song of Solomon, which is her little touch on the ring. When you think about a wedding ring, or any jewelry for that matter, but how it reveals the intelligence or the wisdom of the designer. When you put different stones together, or you cut the stone in a special way for the diamond, for example, to reflect the light, or the ring itself and how it is designed or cut in various ways, and how it reflects the wisdom or the intelligence of the designer. And you could go even deeper than that, relative to the harvesting of stones, diamonds, or whatever, or the harvesting of gold, and the ability that man has now to take this mineral, this hard rock, and we can dig out of the ground, and we can fashion it into something as beautiful as a wedding ring. How it reflects the intelligence of the designer. In that passage that Eric read for us just a moment ago, let me encourage you to look at Ephesians chapter 3. Because the Apostle Paul makes a couple of very important points here about the church of Christ. That it is not an accident. It is not a social club. It is so much more than that. And it has a past that goes into eternity. Look at what Paul says, Ephesians 3. First of all, I want us to read verse 10. Paul says that the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known through the church to the rulers and the authorities in heavenly places. Now, Paul is not speaking here about evangelism. He is not saying that the church is to make known the manifold wisdom of God as we share the gospel with others. That's true, but that's not what Paul is saying here in this verse. Paul is saying here that just like a wedding ring reveals the intelligence of its designer, so Paul is saying that the church reveals the wisdom of God. The manifold wisdom of God, or the multifaceted wisdom of God. And he says in verse 11 that the church was in the eternal purpose of God. Before God said, "Let there be light," God thought there will be a church. And Paul says, back up in verse 8 now, if we go backwards a little, Paul says that God had chosen him to preach to the Gentiles the unfathomable or unsearchable riches of Christ. Verse 9, to bring to light what is the administration of the mystery which was hidden in ages past. Now, a point about that word administration. The English Standard Version used the word plan. The word administration in Greek gives us our English word economy. It's the working out of the plan of God. And so Paul says, God chose me to be the preacher to the Gentiles, to preach the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to reveal the working out of God's plan, which had been hidden in ages past. But this church reveals the multifaceted wisdom of God that has been a part of His eternal purpose. So that illustrates to us how important the church is, and that the church follows a plan. And that is the main point of my lesson this morning. The church has a pattern or a plan that we must follow. Now, let's back up all the way to Genesis chapter 6. Because I want us to realize that God operates with man on the principle of a pattern. If we were to come to God and say, "God, how do I come into your presence and worship?" God would say, "You've got a pattern." If we were to say, "God, how do I come into your presence in heaven? I want to be with you in heaven." God would say, "There's a pattern you have to follow." And we see that point in how God deals with man down through the years. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time, in fact, this morning. So look at Genesis chapter 6, where God tells Noah that he needs to build the ark. Genesis 6 and verse 14, for example, God begins with Noah, "Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with rooms, and shall cover it inside and out with pitch," and so forth. And then verse 22. "Thus Noah did, according to all that God had commanded him, so he did." Now, Noah was the kind of person fundamentally who was going to do what God told him to do. If you look back at verse 8, Noah found grace or favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man, verse 9, and blameless. What does that mean? Before God ever gave Noah the pattern for the ark, Noah was already doing whatever God expected out of him. That's the kind of man Noah was. "God, if you say it, I'm going to do it." And so when God appears to Noah, he says, "Okay, Noah, I want you to build an ark." He says, "Okay, God, I'm going to do it." And Noah did exactly what God had commanded. And in order for God to bless Noah then, Noah had to follow his commands. He had to follow his pattern. If you jump down to chapter 7 and verse 5, again, and this has to do with gathering up all the animals, 7 of the clean animals so that they could be sacrificed later on, and then 2 of the unclean animals. And so verse 5 says, Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. Noah followed the pattern. If you look back at chapter 6 in verse 18, God says to Noah, "I'm going to bring all the animals to you on the ark." But notice what he says, "I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark." Now, some translations in the Hebrew will allow this translation, says, "You will come into the ark." Now, what idea does it convey when God says you will come into the ark? Sounds to me like God is in the ark, doesn't it to you? It sounds to me like that God was going to be with Noah in the ark. And if God is going to be there with Noah in the ark, then Noah's got to make the ark according to the pattern that God laid out. Because if Noah disobeyed, God would not have blessed him. And so Noah did all that God had commanded. That's illustration number 1. Let's look at Moses building the tabernacle. Turn over to the last couple of chapters of Exodus. Exodus chapter 39 and chapter 40. And let's just emphasize the point here made. That Moses, in order for the Israelites to come into the presence of God, God says, okay, build the tabernacle, but you've got to build it the way I tell you to. And so look at Exodus chapter 39, just to read a few verses. But you'll notice on the screen all the verses that emphasize the point. Chapter 39, verse 2, the last part of the verse. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Verse 5, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Verse 7, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. And that point is emphasized over and over and over again through chapter 39 and on into chapter 40. Look at chapter 40, verse 16. Thus Moses did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. So he did. Verse 19 of chapter 40, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So when Moses built the tent in which the Israelites came to offer animal sacrifice and to worship God, they built the tabernacle or the tent just after the pattern that God had given them. And once they had established the tabernacle and built it according to God's pattern, then God comes and dwells among them. Look at the end of chapter 40, verse 34. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. God could not bless Noah until he built the ark according to the pattern. God did not come and fill the tabernacle with his glory until Moses and the Israelites built the tabernacle according to God's pattern. That's illustration number 2. Now turn over to 1 Chronicles. Because when Solomon builds the temple, which was the permanent structure in which the Israelites would worship God, God also did not allow man to build it after his own imagination. God gave the pattern for the temple to be built to David. Look at 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verses 11 and 12, and then verse 19. Then David gave to his son Solomon the plan of the courts of the temple, its buildings, storehouses, upper rooms, inner rooms, the room for the mercy seat, and the plan of all that he had in mind. For the courts of the house of the Lord, and the surrounding rooms, storehouses of the house of God, storehouses for the dedicated things, and so forth. But where did the plan come from? Jump down to verse 19. All this, said David, the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me all the details of this pattern.